Hi YouTubers, Jay Smith back again. We've been going through quite a few subjects, and you've noticed we've been skipping around dealing with the person of God, the name Yahweh, the name Allah. We've talked quite a bit about the Trinity. We've done 3 videos on the Trinity, on the crucifixion. Talked about, goodness sakes, we've talked about the Quran a bit, of whether or not it's corrupted or not, or whether the Bible is corrupted or not. We'll be getting into the Quran and its corruption, and certainly I'll be doing a large critical analysis of the Quran. We're not going to hit that yet. But one area that we've not covered is the Prophet Muhammad. Now, I know it's important that we need to do that. So the next few videos are going to be a series on looking at the Prophet Muhammad. And I'm sure there are going to be some things I'm going to say that will not be pleasing to a lot of the Muslims who are listening. And I'll get a lot of vitriol in your responses there on YouTube. You're good at that, and I think we're expecting it. I'm expecting it. But the first thing I want to talk about is how or what we know about Muhammad. Where do we get our material from? And try to help you understand that there is a dilemma here for Muslims, because the man Muhammad is a historical figure. He lived, supposedly was born in 570 AD and died in 632. So roughly a little over 60 years old before he died. And having been born there, and of course, according to your traditions in Mecca, growing up in Mecca, living in Mecca up until about 610, I'm sorry, not 610, 622. 610 is when he started receiving his revelations while he was living in Mecca. And from 610 to 622, those revelations continued to be received at different periods for that 12-year period, until he then moved from Mecca to Medina at the Hijrah, according to your traditions, in 622, and the last 10 years of his life, 622 to 632, he then lived in Medina, according to your traditions. And you notice I'm saying that over and over again, according to your traditions. And here's the dilemma. Historically speaking, we don't know much about Muhammad from his time period. There is not anything written about him during his lifetime. And so almost everything that we are dependent on for the stories surrounding the Hira cave when he first received his first revelation, surrounding how he received his revelation, even considering the fact that he did receive his revelation, surrounding the fact how he got his authorship or how he got his authority for being a prophet. All these stories, his conflicts with the Quraysh there in Mecca, the difficulty he had with not only the tradesmen there, the fact that not many people followed him when he moved up in 622, even his conflicts with the Jews that lived there in Medina, the Banu Anuka family, the Banu Nadir family, and the Banu Qurayza family, and the Ansar, who were the Arabs who then came alongside him, the Muhajirun who went up with him. All these stories that surround that, they don't come from the 7th century when he was living. No, not at all. They don't come at all from the 7th century. In fact, I don't know how many of you Muslims out there know when they were actually originated. Do any of you know when the life of the Prophet, what we call the Siratul Rasulullah, the Sirah of the Prophet, when it was actually amalgamated, correlated, written down? Not at all from the 7th century. The man you need to go to find out about the Prophet's life is named Ibn Ishaq. But we don't have any of his compilations. They don't exist today. Don't look for it. You're not going to find it. There's lots of references to him. So where do we go to find out about Muhammad? We go to one of his disciples. Ibn Ishaq died in 765. And there's the problem right there. Muhammad died in 632. 765, that's quite a bit later. That's 130 years later. We don't have his material. We have to go to one of his disciples. And the man we go to is named Ibn Hisham. Ibn Hisham died in 833. And he was writing the biography of the Prophet, the Siratul Rasulullah, just before he died, roughly 20 years before he died. And so we're talking about roughly the 9th century, up until 833. Muhammad died 632. That's 200 years later. It takes 200 years for the Muslims to write down the Prophet's story. Now, I have a problem with that as a historian, because certainly there's no reason why it could not have been written down while Muhammad was living. Why didn't he? Of course, he couldn't read and write, but he had scribes around him We know Zayd ibn Thabit was the one that was given the responsibility to write the Quran down. The Quran was written soon after Muhammad's death. It was written within 20 years of Muhammad's death, around 650 at the time of the Uthmanic period. So there was no reason why they couldn't have written down the Prophet's life, what he said, what he did, the hadith of his sayings, the sirah of his life. Why weren't they written in the 7th century? For that matter, why weren't they written in the 8th century? Why is we have to wait till 833 to find about your prophet's life? 200 years. 200 years of what? What was in that 200 years? What was the material that was passed down over those 200 years? And you know the answer. The answer is basically oral tradition. It was oral tradition that was passed down over those 200 years from Muhammad's life through his companions all the way up to Ibn Ishaq, then was related to Ibn Hisham. And even Ibn Hisham says that much of what Ibn Ishaq said he didn't care for, he threw it out and only retained that which he considered to be authoritative. What his criteria was, we don't know. I'd love to know what his criteria was for retaining what he did. So much of what we know about the Prophet, much of what we know what he said and did, the hadith that come much later, we'll talk about that yet to come, that's not for this video, is from the 9th century, what they thought the Prophet did and said. Can it be trusted? Here's the problem, and I leave this with you. Can we trust the Prophet's biography? Should we trust it? And this is the question that's coming up in the School of Orient and African Studies. This is the question that's coming up by the revisionists, the Orientalists who are now looking at the Prophet's life. People like, certainly the ones that I've had to study under, people like Patricia Corona out of Denmark, or Michael Cook here in Britain, or Dr. John Wansborough. These are all people who were studying and also who are teaching at School of Orient and African Studies. Patricia Corona is now in Princeton University teaching this material. So is Michael Cook. Gerald Hawting, who still is at the School of Orient and African Studies, brings this question up. Should we trust this material? Is it viable for today if it's written so late and is a product of oral tradition? And you know what happens with oral tradition. Oral tradition gets embellished. Oral tradition gets changed, manipulated, accreted, deleted. Take out the material you don't like, add that which you do like, so that the person that we have today in the Siratul Rasulullah, that person, Muhammad, that we see today in Ibn Hisham's writing, and after Ibn Hisham comes Al-Waqidi, which is even more embellished, that person is the person that the 9th century people wanted to believe and to relate to us. But is he the man of history? Can we trust his biography? I bring that into this equation, I say that at this time, because many of the claims about Muhammad, the fact that he was the greatest warrior, the fact that he was the greatest arbiter between man and God, the fact that he was the final prophet, he was the seal of the prophet, the fact that he did nothing wrong, he said nothing wrong, he had no sin, the fact that he was the greatest lover, the greatest husband, the greatest leader, the greatest in every category, he is the greatest. He is so embellished, which seems to suggest that this is nothing more than oral tradition, 200 years of oral traditions, and that's where I question it. Now, I just bring that up because the historical equation seems to suggest that the Muhammad we know about, the Muhammad that we read about in all the biographies, many biographies, I've read 6 of them myself, these biographies are not the Muhammad of history, they are the Muhammad of faith. This hagiography that's been amalgamated and compiled and put together possibly in the 9th century. That Muhammad we're going to now talk about. That Muhammad we're going to start questioning. That Muhammad we're going to ask some critical questions of concerning whether or not he can claim to be a prophet, and whether or not he's a prophet for today. Good. I'll leave it there right now. That opens up the debate. We'll get it started there, get the ball rolling, and then we're going to see where we go from there. This is Jay then. Over and out. We'll talk to you later.